Hey YouTube. Hi Spotify. It's Cal, and I'm coming back to you again today with a video in the series on substances. Today we're just briefly going to talk about cannabis. It has, in my opinion, gotten a bad rap. I'm not a huge cannabis user, to be honest with you, but I do think when it comes to all the drugs and all the damage that has been done in people's lives with drugs, I would say what I have seen is that cannabis has been typically the least destructive. Now, they called it the gateway drug. Is that true? I'm not here to debate. All I know is that the harder drugs that we've talked about before have done more damage that I have seen than cannabis in people's lives. Now, the one thing I will say about cannabis is they are actually coming up with I think it's called a motivational disorder that has actually been seen with cannabis, meaning that if people do start to use it every day, first of all, I'm not a fan of using anything every day, like, or depending on, when you start to depend on anything, you do probably have a problem with it. But um, a motivational disorder is basically the one real huge negative consequence that I've seen with people who struggle with cannabis use. Well, first of all, if they struggle with it, there's a bigger issue going on. But if they just recreationally use cannabis use, you can still end up with what is called a motivational disorder. And that's basically because you just, it's the whole sinking into the couch syndrome. So it's basically like you just become so content kind of doing nothing that you're not really motivated towards like life goals or getting out or doing stuff like that. So here comes my cats. But I would say cannabis is yes, basically it's not going to cause maybe necessarily the kind of relationship issues that say cocaine or some of the stimulants might, or alcohol might. But it'll just basically make you very, quote, mellow. Um, and that we're talking about too, there's different strains. So cannabis is all over the place, which is why we're just going to make a brief video about it today. In my substance abuse treatment center, I do believe when I worked there, a primary diagnosis of cannabis use disorder or cannabis dependence was not allowed actually for treatment as a primary diagnosis. Now, it's gotten a lot more popular, so that may have changed, but it was only allowed as a quote secondary diagnosis to some other more serious substance use disorders. So again, I don't know how things have changed. I can only share with you how these things affect my practice and what I've seen. Now, what I will just say is what we're going to talk about in the next couple days coming up is the root causes of addiction. And one of the big, huge root causes that we're going to get into is that the reason why people start to take drugs is to alter their mood away from whatever they're feeling. And so it's basically emotional avoidance or emotional numbing. And so if you start with cannabis, the whole point is if you don't learn to accept all of your feelings regardless, it could very easily blend into some other issue with some other substance or some other addiction, because that's really what substance addiction is. And we'll get into, I mean, it ends up becoming a physiological issue, but primarily it is changing your you're desperate to change your emotional state because you don't like what you're feeling. You think you shouldn't be feeling that way. You don't like either depression or anxiety or shame or whatever is really deep down. And so you start taking substances to, I've said this before, self-medicate or sedate or numb yourself basically out of it and switch your emotional or switch your nervous system state. So, and like I said, part of that I'm guilty of. Like I said, I drink coffee and that does that to a very minor degree, but I'm very conscious of, the effects of these things and making sure that I am not trying to avoid certain emotions. So, and I'm not perfect, but I do know after all these years in working in substance abuse and addiction, when you start to try to avoid what you're feeling, you're only prolonging having to deal with whatever feeling that is. You're basically just kicking the can down the street. And then you end up getting physiologically addicted, which ends up creating a whole new problem in and of itself to whatever substance. So cannabis is a stimulant. It can be, depending on the strain, it can be a stimulant, it can be a relaxant or depressant, and it also falls in the category of hallucinogens, which I am not going to cover in this series because it is a unique category of its own with obviously cognitive hallucinogenic effects. You can imagine something like LSD would fit into that category. And cannabis can too. The other thing about cannabis that they haven't studied that much is it also can be known, if you take it in, certain to certain degrees or at certain times in your life, it can be known to trigger a psychosis if you either get it laced with something or whatever. So the point, again, I'm not, that's not my, cannabis is not my forte. Hallucinogens are not my forte, specifically because when I was working in the treatment centers, one, it was legal in California, and two, like I said, I really didn't see the biggest, life issues stemming from that. I did have a couple of clients who were dependent on it every day and smoked it every day. And again, if you need to do that, and if you're really needing a substance, any substance every single day to alter your emotional state, the question would be, what are you running from, right? What emotional state, whether it's anxiety. So like typically with people who might struggle with cannabis addiction, baby, no, might struggle with cannabis addiction, they typically can be basically it's either like anxiety, no sweetie, or social anxiety. And so some people, okay, there's basically the quote downers or the relaxants in the cannabis group, that is like the indica strains. And then there's quote the uppers or the stimulants. Are you okay, baby? Are you okay? My cat's throwing the water around again. It's fun. I think he freaks out because he doesn't hear me talking to myself. Fortunately, very much. But definitely clearly throws him for a loop when I do. But so the sativa strains can be a stimulant, and for some people that makes them more talkative and they feel more social. So again, and then there's the hybrid strains, which basically kind of like alter your state depending on the strain, depending on, how that particular thing affects you, depending on how much you take of it. So again, I'm not trying to excuse cannabis behavior. Any drug that you are taking to alter your emotional state, you just have to be very aware of why you are taking it. Because like I said before, if you are medicating or trying to change whatever that baseline state is, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, whether it's loss and grief, or irritation or anger or whatever it is going to come circle back to you. What happens is you'll use the drug, whatever it is. Let's just say it's a sedative for anxiety, right? Like this is what happens. So let's just, and I'm going to get into this in the root causes video, so I'm not going to do it very much today, but basically, let's just say you start out with a baseline anxiety of, let's just say 7 out of 10. On a 10 is the most you could feel anxious scale, and 1 is the least you could feel anxious. Well, then you're going to be maybe drawn to some kind of sedative or relaxant to bring you down on that number. Well, the problem is, so say you go, at your max effect on an anxiety medication or something, say you're down to like a 4 out of 10 or something. You think, oh, great, that worked. But the problem actually is that your brain and your body, they rebound to your baseline. So you actually end up a lot of times, and this is what are called withdrawal symptoms, you end up actually getting more anxious within the 24, 48, 72 hours after using a substance if you go without it than you even were at the baseline. So you started at a 7, let's say you got brought down to like a 4 while you were using some kind of anti-anxiety med, and then it is possible, and I've seen it and heard this all the time, that in maximum withdrawal effects, the body is actually trying to gain, the pendulum is swinging back. So they'll go up to like an 8 or a 9 and end up more anxious during the withdrawal state than they were even in the baseline state. So again, I'll go into that in my root causes video, but the whole point is, and the same works for stimulants, right? So like people take a stimulant to give them energy, but the problem is that once, so a max peak point, effective use of that drug, they will feel more energized. But the problem is their body then becomes so tired that the body swings back and they will sleep longer and forever, and not be able to get out of bed once they stop that stimulant use. So again, what goes up must come down. That is very much true with our physiology, and it is also true with substances. So, again, just remember your body will have a rebound state, and it is called withdrawal effects. But sometimes even the withdrawal can be a stronger rebound than you were initially feeling. So that is the whole reason why drugs start out seeming like they're great, but they end up being problematic, right? Because you can imagine if your baseline state ends up at a crazy high level on say the anxiety scale, you might end up with panic attacks. I mean, it can lead to all sorts of things. So it starts out as a short-term solution, ends up being a long-term problem. That is the truth with any drugs if you use it excessively and quote out of moderation. And there are a lot of drugs that you cannot. I've never seen anyone use moderation when it comes to like heroin. I've never seen anyone use moderation when it comes to meth. There are some that you can use in moderation and people actually are able to do it. And I'm not going to name those because I'm not trying to advocate for drug use. But I am just saying, but cannabis is one of those, it actually fits into all the categories and also can be a hallucinogen. And again, there's different strains, but the whole point of it is to alter whatever your naturally occurring emotional state is. Now, recreationally, do I think there's a problem with it? I'm not going to give my personal opinion here. I will, as I've said, and I think insurance companies agree with this because I don't think they cover treatment in California for, and maybe some other states where it's legal, for a primary, cannabis use disorder um, diagnosis. Also because except for the risk of a psychotic episode, which is very small, I've never even met someone who has no, I take it back. I had one client who had one episode of psychosis under a large amount of cannabis. But other than that, the risk when you compare it to the stimulant risk and when you compare it to the relaxant and sedative risk is comparatively small. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. And I don't use it daily. I think I've used it like a handful of times in my life, my whole life. And that started when it was legal in California. I'm square like that. But um the point is, and I don't use it now, but so I'm not trying to like excuse cannabis use, but I am just, it can also be, there are some medical uses for it that I actually do think can be beneficial for people when used in the right dose and when it has been screened for, like make sure it doesn't have any toxic substances in it and all that good stuff. So, anyways, this is not a political thing. My point was to kind of get on and share the effects that can have on the nervous system and also why people might take it is again to alter their natural state of emotional being. And again, when you might start and maybe with cannabis you're doing it, but if you start to want to alter your emotional state and you happen to transition to other drugs, it can easily kind of physiologically get out of hand and get away from you. So I will cover all of that more in the root causes video. And also we're going to talk about treatment interventions and those will be longer videos. But today I just wanted to briefly touch on cannabis. And again, there's the category of hallucinogens and I believe there's sedative hypnotics too. And I'm not going to cover those because again, in my experience, I didn't have enough experience with those as a primary substance use disorder to go into it in these videos, but um AA, again, I'm just giving a plug for everyone. Your medical doctor, if you struggle at all with any kind of substances, your medical doctor and AA, but also your emergency room is where you want to go if you have a real issue and say you're trying to withdraw from alcohol, you actually want to go to the emergency room for that. That's one that you don't want to wing at home because it can be dangerous. There are a few strategies that you could try if you feel like you just have a moderate issue, but the whole point is like that one is dangerous. So, um, go to your ER, but then if you do feel like you struggle with abuse or dependence on other drugs, I would say talk to your, primary care physician, be very honest about how much you use, how often you use. They are very helpful. Sometimes they can just give you kind of what you would need to like wean off the substance. And then also AA is just a phenomenal, I can't get over it. It's such a great resource for people. So, um, but I will talk about that more in the treatment interventions video. And I also will, we'll get more into root causes too in the next video, which is going to be a bit longer. But as you can tell from this video, the essence is when people are trying to get out of their feeling state, right? Whatever they're feeling in their body, they don't like it. They want to change it, whether it means be happier, be more relaxed, be more energized, be, so whatever. It's changing, you're emotionally avoiding whatever you're feeling and trying to alter your feeling state. So, and that is, we'll get into this, but that is really self-judgment and you really judging yourself and saying, I shouldn't be feeling this way. Or, I mean, sometimes it's just, I don't want to be feeling this way. But the bad news that I have for you is you're going to feel that feeling until you process it, until you grieve it, until you like get it out, somehow, and you figure out where is that coming from and how can you, kind of get it out of your body. So that's a different video. I hope that you guys are doing well. Today was a World Cup day, and I hope you Spanish fans out there are very happy, and Argentinian fans, you have my heart too because I love that team. So hope you guys are all doing well out there, and I will see you guys next time.